Welcome to the EpicureanFriends.com book review of A Few Days in Athens, a story about Epicurus and Epicurean philosophy. Please keep in mind that A Few Days in Athens is fictional, and the author is giving you her own interpretation of Epicurus. In a few cases, she deviates from Epicurus's own views fairly dramatically, but when we get to those, we'll point them out to you clearly. Even more, keep in mind that the participants you're about to hear are giving their own opinions. There are many different interpretations of Epicurus, and we hope this book review will prompt you to study Epicurus for yourself. For those who want to read more about Epicurus, the book we recommend the most is Norman DeWitt's Epicurus and His Philosophy. We also invite you to join us for discussion at the EpicureanFriends.com forum and to listen to our companion podcast, Lucretius Today, which is available at all major podcast sources. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll enjoy this session, so let's join it now. This is our sixth session, and we're looking at Chapter 5 tonight. And Scott, you were just saying something that was unexpected to you. What were you saying?
Well, the book really just came to life. We built up some characters, and we got things rolling, and bam, it's like the great fight is ready to begin. And, it's a wonderful Chapter 5, but it just totally leaves you hanging. You cannot. Did anybody read Chapter 5 and not read on to Chapter 6?
I did, but only because I was late getting to the reading and had to cook dinner.
You had to have been frustrated stopping at that point.
Yes.
That's right.
Oh my God. So yeah, it was really it's rollicking good. If I'd have had more time, I would have read Chapter 7 too, because I want to see where this thing goes. It's really great. It's fun.
Well, why don't we go ahead and just set the stage? There's really only one scene here, and I'll do this myself again since unfortunately Joshua's not with us tonight. But the basic situation here is that the prior chapter, the end of Chapter 4, has ended with Theon leaving the garden and for the night. And then the next thing that happens to Theon is that he runs into Cleanthes, who is his friend from the Stoic school. And we can talk about who he is and in history as well. But the bottom line is that Cleanthes sees Theon coming from the house of Epicurus, and he's appalled by that. And Cleanthes, they get into an argument basically, or a confrontation with Cleanthes, alleging basically that virtue can have no connection with pleasure whatsoever. And then there's a lot of detail there that I'd like to talk about as we go through here. But again, just to set the stage for the chapter, they then move over to I presume basically the porch, to the assembly of the Stoics. And at that point, Cleanthes feels like he has no choice but to announce that they have a traitor among them, that Theon has left the house of virtue for that of pleasure and corruption, basically. And Cleanthes argues some things about the road to virtue, which I think are pretty important, that we ought to pay attention to, about how the road to virtue is long and steep, and those who seek after virtue can have no part in pleasure. And basically, this goes on through the whole chapter, and then Zeno arrives, and what Scott was just referring to as the cliffhanger ending is that Zeno arrives with Cleanthes collapsing basically after his denunciation of Epicurus and of Theon for being part of the garden, even temporarily. And that's where the chapter comes to an end. And I was thinking tonight about what basically is maybe the ultimate theme of this chapter. And I realized in the context of this book, we don't often talk about it, but the ancient Stoics saw Epicureanism to be absolutely anathema. They were bitter enemies. They thought that there was no way that a Stoic who was intent on pursuing virtue as the goal of life should have anything to do with pleasure. And we can discuss the details as we talk about some of the aspects of the chapter. But maybe that's the single takeaway, that maybe one of the first eye-opening things that people today might gather in reading this book is that modern Stoics tend to gloss over these differences. And even though they understand that Stoicism has always held virtue to be the goal, and that Epicurus has also held pleasure, they think that basically you can reconcile them without very much trouble. And even here, in different places, the Stoics will talk about happiness of a type being their own goal, but it's a very different type of happiness at the very least than what the Epicurean philosophy teaches. And so we can talk about some of the details of the differences of opinion here, but it shouldn't be lost on anybody who's new to the subject. That won't include most of the people in this conversation tonight, because we're not new to the subject, but those relatively new to the subject will want to understand that, especially from the point of view of the ancient Stoics, They considered they who in the ancient world, they knew their philosophy, they knew Epicurean philosophy, and they who knew both philosophy believed that the two were incompatible and were bitter enemies of each other. So I sometimes find it frustrating that today, when we talk about Stoicism and Epicureanism on the internet, people seem to think, well, these are just two sister philosophies who can easily be reconciled. And that for those of us today who want to study both philosophies, it's just easy to flip back and forth. But that was not the traditional viewpoint of the ancient Stoics or presumably the ancient Epicureans either, for the reasons that the book is going to explore. The parts of this that I selected to focus on, other than just the outline of the chapter, one of the sections I thought was particularly important is the issue of the road to the end, which I think we've discussed in previous sessions, but this one states it all very specifically, that the Stoics viewed the road to the summit to virtue as one that's long and hard and steep. And so the part that I've selected out here, Zeno tells you not that virtue is founded in pleasure and repose, resistance, energy, watchfulness, patience, and endurance. These must be your practice, must be your habit, ere you can reach the perfection of your nature. The ascent is steep, it's long, it's arduous. Today you must ascend a step, and tomorrow a step, and tomorrow, and yet you shall be far from the summit, from rest and from security, which is a point that I think Kevin has made in the past, that you don't really, in most cases, ever reach the summit when you're pursuing virtue from the Stoic perspective. And does this appall you? Does this disgust you? Then go to the gardens, go to the man of Gargetium, of course, is Epicurus, who calls himself a philosopher and who loves and teaches folly. And he shall encourage you and soothe you and shall end your pursuit and give you your ambition, which will show you that virtue is robed in pleasures and is lolling basically in ease. He'll teach you that wisdom is a song and that happiness is in piety. We'll discuss that as the basic text here. Just in case we run out of things to say, I did pull a couple of quotes. I mentioned this before, that I found it very useful to compare what Lucian of Samosata says in his dialogue called Hermotimus, in which he has Hermotimus being a student of Stoicism, discussing things with a friend of his who is not a student of Stoicism by the name of Lycinus. And they have in that dialogue, which I'll link in the show notes here, basically, a discussion back and forth with them about the very same thing, where Hermotimus says that as to philosophy, not only will you never attain it, however long you study, unless you're wide awake all the time, contemplating it with intense, eager gaze. And the stake is tremendous, whether you shall rot miserably with the vulgar herd or be counted among the philosophers and reach happiness. And then Hermotimus also makes the comment that very far off dwells virtue, as Hesiod said, and long and steep and rough is the way thither, and travelers must bedew it with sweat. So it's pretty easy to find text references that indicate that Stoicism was holding the road to virtue as being long and hard and rough. And the last slide I have here tonight, they're continuing their discussion. And Lycinus asked Hermotimus about how long it's going to take him to get to the top. And Lycinus asked, does he think you'll be on the top next year? Mentions a couple of Greek holy days or ceremonies. And Hermotimus says, that's too soon. And Lycinus says, by the next Olympiad then? And Hermotimus says, all too short a time, even that for habituation to virtue and attainment of happiness. And then Lycinus continues to up it in terms of how many Olympiads it might be. And this is the final selection I was quoting here. Hermotimus says, this is not a thing to be compassed and captured quickly, though 10,000 Alexanders were to assault it. In that case, the sealers would have been legion. As it is, a good number begin the climb with great confidence and do make progress. Some very little indeed, others more. But when they get halfway, they find endless difficulties and discomforts, lose heart, turn back, panting, dripping, and exhausted. But those who endure to the end and reach the top to be blessed thenceforth with wondrous days, looking down from their height upon the ants, which are the rest of. So one of the things to gather, I think, out of this chapter is the Stoic conception of the road to virtue being steep and hard and very difficult to attain. So again, the back and forth of the discussion is most of the heart of it is where Cleanthes denounces Theon for participating, going into the garden, denounces the garden of Epicurus as being totally consistent with virtue. That's really the main setup here, and we can just discuss aspects of that, hopefully, and get something out of that. Let's see.
These two characters that you're quoting here, Hermotimus, and then the Lyceum, what's his name?
Something like that.
Those are actual quotes from ancient.
Those are actual quotes from Lucian of Samosata, who's basically writing in about the same time frame as Diogenes Laertius, I think.
Okay, so those are valid quotes of Stoicism, and okay.
That's my strong understanding. Now, again, Kevin, would you agree?
Seems totally accurate to me. I've never read Lucian, but I was thinking Epictetus is famous for when people came to study with him saying, most of you are weak, your Epicureans can leave now.
So there's not much doubt that they considered it to be a long and hard and an arduous task. And I guess really that's one aspect of the takeaway, but the rest of it is just the fact that if the road to virtue is so long and arduous and so difficult for everyone, that emphasizes that really pleasure has nothing to do with it. That pleasure is, in fact, an obstacle that slows you down and prevents you from getting to the top, prevents you from getting to the goal. Like I say, it's been an interesting observation over the years when I've been talking about Epicurean philosophy. The people today who talk about Stoicism, I don't know if they don't understand that or they just think that that's not important. As to Stoicism, at least those who are not fundamentalist Stoics, they've completely put that to the side. So that's one thing.
It's definitely been done. It's kind of weird that ended up because it seems to be pretty clear. But there's really a lot more to talk about here than I thought about. But I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. I mean, this heroic thing. Why would a philosophy even become popular if it was so horrendously difficult? It's like you're never going to make it. You're gonna die losing. So why go out? I mean, why would it be popular? I mean, I'm just saying this in a really pragmatic sort of sense. Not just how could it be popular? I mean, it was a big thing. Gosh, what a terrible setup.
I've been talking, Kevin. I bet you got answers to that.
I still find a lot of people there's an appeal to Stoicism, the self-mastery, right? The conquering your emotions, that the one thing you can control is your own self. That has tremendous appeal. And even the hard work part of it, right? A lot of it is not emphasized. You'll never get there, but a lot of it is sort of self-discipline. And right, I mean, that the Stoics, when they say things like, go for a day without eating, just so you'll know you can handle it, right? In the cold, take off your cloak so you'll know you can deal with the cold. And the Epicurean response is, no, I like being warm and food is good. But that sort of sense of just pushing yourself to the limits, right? Even little things, right? I walked my dog in the rain today. She wanted to go out and I just said, all right, you want to go out in the rain, you want the walk, I can walk in the rain as long as you can, dog.
Yeah, there's that appeal of it's not exactly the appeal of asceticism, but it's like you say, the ability to discipline yourself. Even today, especially men, I guess, and Stoicism seems to have an appeal, especially to the men who
what
like
woman would fall for this?
That's a good.
Some of my friends who study this call them broicism. And try
I love it.
Well, and you've got all sorts of modern movements like this. And I've never really fully understood what men going their own way was and all these other different things that you hear about.
Could this be also that they were, early on, figuring out the gamification of philosophy? Because, if you have a game and you can't get to the final goal, you just keep going on. And there's always something more to play. If you really defeat the game, it's no fun. I don't know.
That I've never thought of, but it's kept the money rolling in for a few centuries.
Say what?
I said it's kept the money rolling in for a few centuries.
Yeah.
I always, in my mind, I'm not built to be a football player or anything like that. Maybe Kevin is. Kevin's a little bit bigger maybe than both of us. But, it's the kind of thing you see when you see guys out on some playing field. They'll just, I can beat you up just because I can beat you up. It's kind of like a competition among male egos to some degree, just to discipline yourself. And I can certainly see the attraction of it to some degree, but
that's always been my response to Marcus Aurelius. It's really easy to take everything in stride when you're the emperor of Rome.
That's right. Yeah, I've not found a lot of interest in reading too much of Marcus Aurelius. Scott, have you read Marcus Aurelius?
Oh yeah, I used to read him quite a bit. I've still got a copy of
Okay.
his meditations, here. Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there's
Mm-hmm.
certain things that I like in there. I mean, in fact, I would at some point argue that I don't think that Stoicism and Epicureanism are that far apart. I think it's just a twist, and you can see a lot of commonality. It doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, you have to sort of look at it from certain perspectives. And one of the perspectives is this issue of virtue, virtue versus pleasure is the goal. I mean, the issue of disciplining yourself to accomplish a goal and keeping apart from dependence on things that you can't control and so forth. Those definitely are commonalities. But the ultimate goal of it, these guys in the ancient world seem to have no problem at all in thinking it's just absolutely incompatible.
Yeah. I like the way Wright's put that here, though. I don't have page number, obviously, but in the middle of one of Cleanthes' rants, right? He talks about Phi on that virtue which prudence alone directs, and then sort of does give a sort of superficial, accurate picture of Epicurus, that you do virtuous things because they bring you pleasure, and then ends with saying, where is the dignity in that? Where's the human dignity? I think that's sort of the Stoics are always looking at that direction. It's not for pleasure that you do things because it's the dignified thing for a human being to do. And that I don't think, like Scott was saying, is that far off, right? The real understanding of Epicureanism, that doing the right thing, being virtuous should bring pleasure for the kind of being you are. I don't think it's exactly the same, but it's
not exactly the same, but it's just a twist.
Yeah. And I was thinking earlier when you were saying, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a long tradition in the Middle Ages when they didn't have any Epicurean writings of just assuming they were the same. That Epicurus approached the pleasure you get from being a good person, and the Stoics approached the hard work, and really they were the same, and they just didn't have any of the Epicurean writings to confirm that.
I've kind of observed that from just noticing that whenever it was brought up in that period that I would read, you'd kind of see them presuming that. But is there, you sound as if there's particularly a reference for them presuming that. Do you know that?
Yeah, Peter Abelard and John of Salisbury are the ones I know best. And both say the same thing, that Epicurus properly understood and the Stoics properly understood are doing the same thing. And their problem with them is that they're not Christian. There's a dispute between the two of them. They're just doing the same thing, and one gets pleasure. Craptastic. One of them emphasizes pleasure. One of them emphasizes discipline and control. But it's the discipline, the pleasure you get from the discipline and control and being in charge of yourself.
But I see, again, like I think you're also saying, Kevin, I see also that it is kind of the same project. It just don't look like it.
Yeah.
So the Epicureans have the same work to do as the Stoics. They need to renounce foolishness and, wanton lust and just, crazy recklessness. They need to use wisdom in order to approach virtue, but they're just being more honest about the fact that when you get there, as you approach there, even what you're doing is feeding your natural desire to feel good about yourself. Same project. It's just the Stoics are lying about it, and they do a bad job of being Epicureans.
I remember in that Thomas Jefferson letter where he said that I too am an Epicurean. I think it's in that one. He accuses the Stoics of he used the word grimace, Grimac. And I presume I kind of know what that word means. I don't know exactly myself, but it's almost as if they're just posturing. Everything's a sort of an act or a posturing or a dramatization. Or it's an appeal to some kind of a pretext almost. But that seems to be, that's kind of what this guy's doing here in this. He's talking about Leonidas at Thermopylae. He's talking about Socrates and Plato and Xenophon and all these people who were the glorious, the Solon and so forth. They keep casting illusions as if there is this higher goal that pleasure can just have no part of. I guess that's a kind of a foreign way of looking at it to most of us today. Not all of us, but most.
I also like going through here that Cleanthes just completely loses his cool. He gets so emotionally invested in the argument that he passes out. That's not Stoic.
Yeah.
He is worse at being a Stoic than that character we saw in chapter 1 was at being an Epicurean.
And he gets kind of denounced by that in the next chapter, I think. All right. So this is sort of a transition chapter, but so we can talk about anything else you want to pull out of it, or
there was one other thing I
just
noticed
anything else in general here.
Right. When Cleanthes starts, he says he wants Epicurus to come where he wants, who's it, Theon, to come and say that, prove him that Epicurus is perfect in every way, pure in action, right? What is it? So let him come forth and say the master in the gardens is not only pure in action, but perfect in theory. And that's not what any Stoic ever, I mean, this is what we were just talking about. The Stoics never reach the end themselves, but he asks for Epicurus to come and be perfect in every way. And I'm just not sure Cleanthes really understands what he's doing yet, which is kind of odd. The whole picture of Cleanthes was just weird to me, because I know Cleanthes is the one who inherits the running the Stoa from Zeno, and even the physical picture of him. I'd always been, whenever it's come up, I'd always been taught that Cleanthes had been a boxer and not the sort of young, fine boned, almost pretty boy that he gets described as. But the whole Cleanthes, the whole depiction of Cleanthes kind of threw me a bit in this chapter.
I believe they talk about him being a boxer and make some other comments about him in the upcoming chapters, but I don't think they've done that yet. But Cleanthes is obviously, like you're saying, Kevin, a historic figure within the Stoic school and formerly a boxer. And does that mean he carried into his reputation that he was confrontational? Is that part of his reputation? Or
I just assumed he'd be kind of physically bigger and more beat up, described there. Whenever a philosopher can claim to have been an athlete of any kind, we just tell that story.
Another issue popped into my head on this chapter: the gender thing. The masculine, macho versus effeminate element. I think that's very interesting, and I almost wonder. In fact, I don't wonder. I think it's just practically damn true that there's a biological element at work here. Men have always, and will probably always to some extent, because of a difference in chemical composition, they'll beat their chests and go around with this because biologically the men are supposed to be more likely to do the fighting and so forth, or the hunting or whatever, more likely to do. They have bigger upper body strengths, blah, blah, blah. So I think some of this needs to be in the back of our heads as we think of these things they are driving. And probably not many women really got into Stoicism. Philosophy was very much a masculine thing anyway. It was only the Epicureans who were kind of breaking ranks here and like, hey, what are the women doing in this business? And why are you guys being not so macho? But this was a problem also for the philosophy. I think because, the guys, they have to go home, they have women, and if they're in charge, maybe they can get away with the Stoicism. But at a certain point, the women are going to be like, hey, that sucks. We got to, I don't go along with that. And I wonder if, for instance, it was actually a flaw in the philosophy, a problem with it. Biology was driving a great portion of what was happening, even though nobody's so much conscious of it. And I think, for instance, Christianity might have even found a way to have that heroic challenge, the hero's journey and so forth, and yet to find a way that women could be brought into it because they didn't go all the way with that. They had something else that was more interesting that twisted the philosophy in a different way. Having a relationship with Jesus, who is, this loving element. I don't know. But I do feel that in a way that Stoicism might have even been hampered by its excessive masculinity.
I can say that that's true now. It's not universal, but I mean, every semester I teach this to the freshmen, and the women are not nearly as interested in Stoicism as the number of eye rolls that I will get from female students when I'm trying to defend the view in class.
Kevin, one of the books that I hear people will talk about a lot on the internet is The Therapy of Desire by Martha Nussbaum. Now, she, of course, is female, and she seems to be heavily in the Stoic mold. It's an obvious point, and we constantly make the point that Leontium and these other women were in the garden. But now that I don't know that I've ever flipped it over and just thought about, well, are there any Stoic philosophy women in the ancient world or really much today? It really is a masculine oriented philosophy, but are there any other major Stoic females associated with Stoicism? I mean, and I don't know that Martha Nussbaum is considered to be a Stoic, but her book is certainly more favorable, I think, towards the Stoics than it is to Epicurus.
I've always thought of her as a Stoic. I just finished her latest book where she argues that the Stoic cosmopolitan ideas is wrong. She still very much likes the other Stoic ideas.
I didn't realize she's still writing. What's her current book? I had the impression maybe Therapy of Desire was 25 years old and maybe she was already dead or something. But maybe
no, Therapy of Desire is like 30 years old. And actually, I just read it 2 years ago. It came out when I was in graduate school, and all my professors sort of poo-pooed it because women shouldn't be writing about Stoicism. And I literally just read it 3 years ago, and what a damn waste listening to my faculty was. But But yeah, I think the new one is called the Cosmopolitan Ideal.
Okay.
Yeah, she's still writing, but she's the only woman I can think of, the female philosopher who's really defending and into Stoicism.
Well, I guess we're reading a book by a female philosopher here
Yeah.
in Frances Wright. So we've got that
Oh.
example, and we have Leontium and so forth. And I can see women having more commonality with the Epicurean side. I guess I
have a friend, Helen, who swears by Marcus Aurelius as the guide to everything. But I think
really?
Yeah. So I mean, there are some, I suppose.
Would we brand Ayn Rand as a possible Stoicishness?
I'm watching Kevin grimace there and shake his head. So Kevin, you're going to say no, obviously.
I was going to say no. Yeah.
I would I think I would probably agree with you, Scott. And in fact, I've talked more in the past, probably with Scott and Calasini than with you, Kevin. I read much Ayn Rand in my earlier years. And at this point, I would really consider her to be her reason and logic orientation, her rationality, her deification almost of reason. Even though she would strongly deny it, I think I would probably accuse her of being the Stoic type, even though she sort of hits back against it in certain aspects of her life. But when she starts her focus within the objectivist circles on rationality and logic and just pursuing that as the basis of the ultimate man, I can see a Stoic side to that.
I can see that too.
And I would propose that instead of trying to determine whether she is or isn't, there's just something to be learned from trying to ferret out, well, what about her is Stoic and what is not, which Kevin probably knows more about than.
Yeah, everything Cassius just said I can see as Stoic. It's the lack of obligations to other people, the lack of duty to yourself and the universe. It's the pure individualism that I see as not Stoic, but the rationality and the not being swayed by emotion and the following principles of justice, no matter what it does to who. I mean, well, without regard to benefit or consequences, I can totally see as in with the Stoic.
And
the strong anti-Platonism
yes
would apparently put her outside the Stoics. But in my mind, again, the rationality and the logic, and of course, she wouldn't really say virtue was the goal. She'd say selfishness or whatever. But then the virtue of selfishness is one of her books. Yeah. So you're right, Scott. Thinking about how different people combine certain aspects of Stoicism and follow it or not follow it, very helpful.
That's also what Scott was saying a couple minutes ago, that they're engaged in the same project with their own take on it and their own,
And of course, if you've got, over here Stoicism and it's a square, and over here Epicureanism, it's a round hole, then you're going to have trouble. But, there's these things morph, and they're in some little ways here. You've got some activities that really are kind of pursuing the same goal and so forth. So it's really interesting to see how these things relate and differ. I learned about Stoicism, I think, from considering, well, is Ayn Rand a Stoic? And I'm just interested in learning. So I think it's all fascinating.
Well, when you drill down in Stoicism, there's just absolutely no doubt that they condemn pleasure, condemn emotion, all of those things as obstacles to their goal. And I think the opposite is true with Epicurus. If not, even though he would talk about control of his emotions or control of and tuning pleasure to ways in which it's achievable and so forth, he's still by no means seeing those as adverse to the goal. He's defining the goal in terms of the things.
Yeah, and then learning to take pleasure in what's available and what's easily attainable is very different than saying pleasure is deluding you in some way and a misapprehension of what's going on.
Scott, you've really got me on a theme here lately, because I now can see both sides a little bit better than in the past, and that I can see how it's easy to conclude that they're sort of basically on the same path in practical terms and in the way you actually carry things out. But when you step back and sort of, okay, I'm going to approach this logically above all. I'm going to put up categories on the wall and I'm going to write these words down and see if I can fit them together. When you really go into the abstraction of identifying a single goal and you line up virtue versus pleasure, it's easier for me to see that they're totally incompatible. But that's kind of just from a logical point of view as opposed to practicality of it.
Yeah, practicality. That's the word there. I mean, why are
they
doing
I think
that?
they both.
Why are they putting Postit notes on the wall and trying to line them up? Why are they doing that?
Well, I do think that I think both approaches do have their value at different times from different perspectives. I think it's wrong to probably try to dispose of either one of the two perspectives, but you've got to kind of keep them in the context in which you're coming up with them in order to understand them. Because again, I'm so frustrated to just say pleasure is the goal of life. Okay, I understand that in terms of my flag or my banner, but it doesn't tell me anything in terms of what I'm going to do 5 minutes from now. Pleasure, what, is it, am I going to eat? Am I going to drink? Am I going to take a bath, or what am I going to do? It's you have to unwind it. And like I say, it's almost like, to me, nowadays, a flag. And I think flags are very useful. Flags have a lot of importance.
They're also very dangerous.
They're also very dangerous if you misuse them. That's exactly right.
One of my sayings is one of our greatest enemies is identity. It's the most dangerous thing in the world.
Go ahead and explain that a little bit further before we.
Well, whether your identity is a Christian or some other religious perspective, or an ethnic group, or a Ukrainian or an Israeli or a Russian, these are the things that cause, when I consider myself to be a Stoic and you're not, boom, okay, we have a confrontation. When my identity becomes softer and I realize I'm not really a thing that you crust up so hard, and I can learn and so forth and become flexible, my identity starts to move. I don't identify in many ways as many things that I'm supposed to. I'm actually half Ukrainian, but that's, these things really cause problems. They're wonderful in a way, but man, I mean, whenever anybody's battling over anything, somebody's got a difference of who they are. This is my territory. You don't belong. That's kind of, I'm trying to my best shot at it. There you go.
What do you think, Kevin?
I've been thinking a couple minutes ago when you were talking that the distinction between the Epicureans and the Stoics is it reminds me in some ways of fights between like the Missouri Synod Lutherans and the Wisconsin Synod Lutherans, and you're all basically on the same page, right? Yes. I mean, you even get there might be an iota of difference, but it's probably not worth killing each other over. On the other hand, that might be what makes us more inclined towards being Epicureans, because the killing each other just doesn't bring pleasure. Whereas if you're a Stoic and you need to get it right.
But I have the reason I say those. Go ahead, Cassie.
Well, I was just going to say, Scott, the twist I would put on your identification of the word identity, or just let's talk about flags or whatever. I certainly agree with everything you've just said. At the same time, I can see circumstances and situations in which your flag or your banner is appropriate. If you're walking down some road and it forks in two different directions and there's two flags on those two different directions, you can learn and make decisions to some extent based on those flags. And in fact, if you fail to consider what those two flags might mean, you could easily be dead 2 steps down the road if you go the wrong direction. So I guess what I'm saying is coexistence between the two, that flags have their uses and their dangers at the same time.
Have you been to Belfast?
That's probably a very good example. I think we can probably, the situation in Ukraine is probably so mixed up and confusing that we could probably use it without even getting too far into politics, which I try to stay away from. But it's so difficult to understand. Things get so complicated. Flags do have their uses at times. So
it's important. I mean, we can't talk. I mean, our language is basically a bunch of flags.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
You have to have that, but they should only be tools helping us go in the direction that we really want to go in, which doesn't have anything to do with the tools itself. It's the old finger pointing at the moon kind of thing. Don't get hung up on the finger. You're going to stick it in your eye. But an example of this would be, as I said a little bit earlier, Stoics are just bad Epicureans, right? What are they doing? They're doing the same thing that every organism does. They're moving after their pleasure. If they're studying philosophy,
now, Scott, if Epictetus and these guys were here, I don't think they would appreciate you saying that, because they were saying that there's a divine fire in the universe, that there's a creator, there's a purpose to everything, there's fate, with the spinners up there just saying what's going to happen to you in your life and so forth. And that's the sort of the physics, the metaphysics part of Stoicism that really nobody talks that much in the modern Stoics. But they had a reason for their conclusions.
Yes, but that doesn't matter. because the reason that they
says you, but go ahead.
I'm serious. The reason they went.
Now, I hate to defend the Stoics here, but I have to keep you
You're
honest.
doing admirably.
They would disagree.
Sure, they would disagree. But the fact of the matter is, I think, is that they are ignoring what's really going on inside of them. If they're heading towards heroic goals, it's because it makes their life feel worthwhile, that they're participating in something cosmic. That's a fantastic feeling. You can actually learn to love displeasure. You can learn to hate to cut yourself and so forth, as the Stoics almost do. But it's because you're doing something that makes you feel good, but pleasure doesn't quite capture that feel good. But it's nonetheless, it is still the basic drive of the organism to want to feel okay about itself.
I think that's why when they're careful, they talk about apatheia, not feeling in the face of those things, rather than feeling good because of them, right? Especially with hardship, right? The thing through the Middle Ages is a Stoic could be perfectly happy in hell because they just wouldn't be bothered by any of the punishments. Right. It's not that they'd be experiencing pleasure. It's just that it wouldn't matter to them. And I think if the Stoics think about the extreme cases that way, I certainly see that being unbothered by everything that's going on prevents displeasure. And that in itself is a pleasure. Epicurus, even Plato says a little bit of that. But the Stoics just want to say, nope, you're just unbothered, unaffected at all.
Not that any of them ever totally reach that.
No, I don't think.
You're an organism. Get real.
No, I'm not. I'm a human being with control over my mind.
Now, if I were a competent Stoic, I'd probably be wanting to trot out. Kevin, isn't there something called the hymn to Zeus or something like that out there that the Stoic?
Yeah, but I don't know it either.
I know that it exists. I can't quote it or anything like that, but they were serious. They claimed to be serious about their religious orientation. I'm sure they saw that virtue was wrapped up in all of that, which I would, and I think
it's one.
Without regarding,
I think they'll talk about virtue and not pleasure, because virtue is doing what you're supposed to, and the universe isn't about you. Right, your role in the universe is not about you; it's about the universe, and there's no reason to expect it to be pleasurable.
Right. Stoicism was certainly very, at least in my view, easy to meld into Christianity, the different theories of, I'm not an expert by any means in, the different came up with it, blended it all. At any rate, it's easy to see that there are commonalities.
Now you're going to remind me of words I don't know either. This is killing me.
It's not Neoplatonist. There's a word that we have a guy on the forum who's really into Matt, who hasn't appeared lately.
Plotinus.
Plotinus. Okay. Anything else tonight? Because we're going to go next week into, I believe next week, Theon responds somewhat to what Cleanthes says, and then I think Zeno speaks, and then I think we have one more chapter after that before himself respond. We have a pretty interesting one next week with Zeno. I should probably save it for that, but they
I haven't read it. Don't spoil it.
Yeah, that's right. Let's save that. I think we've covered tonight. Ancient Stoics held that there was incompatibilities between these two philosophies that they just could not breed. That's not what people are into today, as Scott's been talking about as well.
Well, we would see the same thing today from, for instance, Christians. Part of my family is fundamentalist Christian and the other half is not, as so many families are. And, if I try to discuss with my sister that she is pursuing Christianity at root because it's a selfish thing to do, she doesn't want to hear that. But all you have to do is keep asking the questions and stuff. And it's really difficult to hide from that. It's the same kind of thing.
Yeah. And it's not as bad as Kevin's illustration. I guess I'm showing my age. I don't know that, are they still killing each other in Belfast and in Northern Ireland like they used to? I mean, it used to be when I was growing up, it was bombs all the time.
Oh, yeah.
And it was constant turmoil. I don't know if it's still going on like that in Northern Ireland or not. I guess they're not bombing. The Irish Republican Army is not as active as it used to be.
There were a few attacks 3 years ago before the pandemic. I know because one of them was the week before I was supposed to go over with a student group. But no, for the most part, they've just sort of matured and stopped fighting a bit. The peace process is working, but the neighborhoods, what you get is really, really aggressive flag flying. You know exactly whether you're in a Unionist or a Irish neighborhood immediately. And that's true in Belfast. It's true in Derry. That it's funny to take American students over there and have them see from where we get the American flag. Now we get the American flag with multicolored versions. But over there, that there are two flags, and it really does signal a change in border effectively, right? You can cross the street and you're with a different political group. Fun.
Well, that's a good way to conclude tonight, because I do think that's a good example of what we're talking about, is that those flags are dangerous and they lead to all sorts of discord and killing each other. On the other hand, from moment to moment, when you're trying to stay alive, ignore what the flags are. You do so at your peril when you find yourself on the wrong side of the dividing line. So it's very interesting there how those two perspectives, I think, can coexist, and that to get rid of either one of them entirely would be imprudent.
Yeah, because the people are there.
You do want to stay alive. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Anything concluding tonight? I really appreciate everybody being here and continuing to help. Well, we miss Joshua not being here with his storytelling. He'll make up for it next week, hopefully. Kevin, anything else tonight?
No, this is fun. Thank you all. I'm really enjoying it.
Great. Very good. Very good. Okay. Well, then in that case, let's close for the night and we'll see you next week. Okay. Bye.
There you go.
Good night.